So kids, as everyone knows, right, kids are incredibly resilient, but I didn't really expect how resilient some of these children were, where it was almost like a blip. Yeah, sure, that's our roof now. And it kind of brings in this blue light, and it's fine. It's kind of scary sometimes, but otherwise it wasn't really as much of a factor in their lives. And then I really focused on the kids who found ways to engage with it playfully. It's normal. It doesn't mean it's actually okay that they're in the situation, but they're adapting regardless.
Welcome to Forum, Beyond the Pages, the podcast that tells the stories behind the stories of Florida Humanities award-winning magazine. I'm Andrew Quintana. It's all about great storytelling this season as we speak with some of the Florida Book Award winners featured in our summer 2024 issue of Forum. This week, children's author Sara Echenique on her recent book, Our Roof is Blue. Every spring, the Library of Congress calls on each state and territory center for the book to select a pair of titles that best represent their homeland. Then, the chosen books are featured at the annual National Book Festival in Washington, D.C. As Florida Center for the book, Florida Humanities selected 2 titles that recently received honors at this year's Florida Book Awards. One of those books was Sara Echenique's children's book, Our Roof is Blue, a heartfelt story about 2 siblings who work to recover and rebuild after Hurricane Maria destroyed their home in Puerto Rico. As Echenique discusses in this episode, the story is her attempt to speak to the trauma a child might experience after surviving a natural disaster. Well, first of all, congratulations on all the recent success with this book. I think it's the kind of story that can resonate with a lot of Floridians who have family in Puerto Rico, and I don't think it really matters what age they are. I think it's a story that anyone can relate to, which kind of makes sense since the story is based on your own lived experiences. What inspired you to write it?
The story of Our Roof is Blue, in Spanish, Nuestro Techo es Azul, it really came to me in stages. It started in 2017. My family and many others lost their electricity. My family in Puerto Rico lost their electricity during Hurricane Irma. And then 2 short weeks later, Hurricane Maria struck. And I was not living on the island at the time. I live on the mainland. I currently live in South Florida. I and many others kind of from the diaspora were watching as Maria approached, and we were hoping beyond hope that it wouldn't hit because Puerto Rico is so small. What are the odds that it would get hit twice? And unfortunately, it didn't shift, and it hit and was incredibly devastating. People were without electricity, without water, without food, without gasoline for months and months on end. But thankfully, my family was very fortunate. I visited Puerto Rico that December, so a few months later. And while I was there with my family, in particular my parents, I was really struck by the sea of blue tarp roofs that you would see literally everywhere, first when you flew in and then even just driving around. And then shortly after that visit is around the time that we moved to South Florida. And I would just constantly be reading about Puerto Rico. I always do that anyways, but of course, after the hurricane struck, I was really focused on that. And I came across an article that was really focused on how the post-Hurricane Maria trauma was affecting young children. And as a children's author, that really struck a chord with me. I also have 3 young children of my own. And so the story really flowed from there, trying to understand and remember what my experience was of hurricanes when I was younger and what it would be like for my own children experiencing that, now having been on the side of being a parent and seeing it kind of from that outside perspective.
You mentioned wanting to explore trauma in your author's note, or at least the trauma a child might experience during a natural disaster. How did you go about tapping into that childlike understanding of the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think having young children really helps. I also really just enjoy children's literature, so I'm constantly reading books to my children and also on my own, especially now that I have an 11-year-old. We read a lot of the same books. And so I went into this story knowing that I really wanted to trust my readers, both young and old, because it is a serious topic, but children encounter serious topics all the time in their day-to-day life. And you really have to trust them to know that they know how to engage with that, even if it might be in a different way than an adult. And so I think a lot of kids even want and need these types of stories. So in my mind, there were 2 types of ideal readers. One is kids who have experienced all of these things, the trauma, the effect of a massive weather event or whatever the case may be, a fire, whatever it could be. And then everyone who hasn't, because there's value in both seeing yourself and your lived experiences and then also seeing the lived experiences of others that just gives you that kind of empathy and that perspective that you might not otherwise have. And unfortunately, especially in Florida, many of our kids will be impacted by those types of inclement weather events, or they already have been. And so I wanted to make it something that felt digestible, but also ended on a note of hope
I act brave, so I will feel brave. That seems to be the motto for the young girl in the story. Was that something you told yourself as a kid, or is that something that came to when writing it, or maybe through discussions with your own children?
I think all of the above. I don't know that I was that eloquent as a child to know that I would be telling myself that, but I do remember giving myself a lot of pep talks. I do that for my children as well, right? They can do hard things and they're still hard and they're still challenging, but they can do them. And so it felt like approaching even just the emotion of bravery in a similar fashion to give them agency over it. Okay, I have a choice here in how I'm going to feel in some ways, even though the external part of it, the hurricane, their roof is blowing off, whatever is going on with Antonio, the little boy who loses his voice after the hurricane, all of that is somewhat out of their hands, but they have control over that piece and how they react to it. Those are conversations I have with my kids, but they're not as, obviously not as tidy, because when you're writing, I have a lot of revisions. And when I'm parenting, you only get the one shot in the moment to kind of talk through it, even though I might have other ways I would have approached something, when I think about it at 11 p.m. and at night.
Beyond just being a story about real life natural disasters, the book actually plays with themes of family, sibling dynamics, and just using your imagination to get through adversity. What are you hoping readers take away from the story?
I'm always inspired by Puerto Rico, and it really colors everything that I do, everything that I think through, even in my day job and how I parent. And so for me, part of the inspiration that I get from Puerto Rico is people on the island are being put in these completely untenable positions time and time again, only to persevere, to find creative solutions that might break to problems that might break others. And they often do it with a really unmatched sense of humor and wit. When I would go onto the island, they were kind of laughing and jovial about stuff that honestly would have had me probably crying if I were experiencing it. And so to me, it's a humbling way of trying to tell one small piece of the story. I would never expect to tell the entire story. No one person could. But I was hoping that this one small part of the story would provide that mirror or that window or that door for a child or for a family that's looking for it, or that's looking for a way to talk about or engage with a topic that sometimes feels so enormous that there is no way to really kind of bring it down to your daily life.
The story is kind of a hodgepodge of inspirations from, recent visits, family members, and your own experience. However, how much of your own experience as a child in Puerto Rico inspired the story of Antonio and his little sister?
When I was younger, the two biggest hurricanes that I remember are Hurricane Hugo, which I think was in '89, and I was about 4 or 5, and then Hurricane George was in '98, and I was much older, so I was in probably 8th grade. And I remember both of those, a lot of the scenes that you'll see in the hurricane prep, especially, where it's the gathering of the supplies and it's kind of cozy and dark inside. And I'm sure my parents were busy freaking out about making sure we were safe, but it felt very different to me as a child, because I was like, oh, this is fun and different and kind of cool, and I can play with my older brother and my baby sister who came along later. So a lot of that definitely went into it. We were very fortunate in that we never lost our roof or anything like that. We did have other effects, during Hurricane George, we didn't have water for a very long time. I remember we ended up getting kind of chlorine rashes because we would, again, very fortunate, bathe with water from the pool. And so that was just something that really stuck in my mind, of all these kind of after effects that you don't ever see on the news. It's not really something you ever think about. So I wanted to bring in those details that only if you've really truly experienced that would you necessarily think to bring out. And what I think is interesting is a lot of my friends in South Florida, that I actually spoke with as I was researching for the book, because I've never lived under a blue tarp roof, and I did want to make sure I spoke with children who have. They say that it captures it, and it resonated with them. So I feel that hopefully it was successful in that regard, that to bring forward that authenticity. But it was that fear of the unknown, the moment as it's happening, and you're all kind of huddled together and you're kind of bonding, and you're, again, as a parent, I would probably be freaking out, but they don't show it. And you're engaging, you're playing games, and you have your flashlights, and this is a fun, almost kind of camping experience. And then they're trying to shield you from something that is not something you can actually shield them from, right? In this case, it was the roof blew off. There was no way to avoid that. It was pulling from lots of various parts of my experience, but it's not, I didn't live exactly this story, nor could I really have, I think.
I find that part fascinating when it comes to writing fiction. Just how do you toe the line between inspiration and, this is where the fake story that I am writing is going to take off from here. When you were talking about speaking to the kids and asking them questions, in order for you to tell this story, you had to really speak with children and really understand their mindset during a time like this. What did you learn when talking to them?
I learned that for a lot of them, it becomes normal very quickly. So kids, as everyone knows, right, kids are incredibly resilient, but I didn't really expect how resilient some of these children were, where it was almost like a blip. Yeah, sure, that's our roof now. And it kind of brings in this blue light, and it's fine. It's kind of scary sometimes, but otherwise it wasn't really as much of a factor in their lives. And then I really focused on the kids who found ways to engage with it playfully, because that to me really spoke about, okay, they are adapting to their environment. It doesn't mean it's normal. It doesn't mean it's actually okay that they're in the situation, but they're adapting regardless.
Of course, this is a children's book, so it's going to have some really unique illustrations attached to the story. This is your second children's book, but it's the first time you've worked with an artist. That artist, by the way, is Ashley Vargas. What is the process like of working with an illustrator on your stories? Are you sending ideas of what you envision to the artist, or are you just trusting them to bring your story to life?
I was really fortunate because Charles Bridge Publishing is the publisher that produced this book, and my editor, Julie Blyven, were both incredibly encouraging and wanted me to be a very active participant in a process that I think in other publishing houses might exclude a little bit the author. And so we talked a lot around my vision, which very thankfully aligned with Julie's vision. And we talked around what we wanted the illustrations to say that maybe is implicit in the text, but is not explicitly stated. Because in picture books, there's a lot of story that occurs, obviously, in the illustrations. It's not being said in the text. So even a character like the dog, I always envisioned there being a dog there. The dog's not mentioned in the text, but he's in the story. I have a dog that's a rescue from Puerto Rico, actually after Hurricane Maria. And so we had a lot of these conversations. And when we selected Ashley, she was incredibly open to it being kind of a collaboration and not necessarily now she's going to take it and do this thing on her own. But writing is a very similar collaboration too. It's just done a little differently. And so it was a lot of, okay, here's what she's thinking. And then we would kind of discuss, sometimes live, sometimes not, around, well, what are we envisioning happening in this moment that's not necessarily in the text, or that is? And do you want to be just representing what's in the text on a particular page versus on the spread where, for example, they are really engaged in extreme imaginative play, and they're parachuting and they're underwater and all of that. Some of it's in the text, but not all of it is, right? There's dancing frogs. That's not in the text, but frogs are a huge part of Puerto Rico, right? Little cookie frogs. And so we talked around bringing through that authenticity and that lived experience of these are kind of symbols to the Puerto Rican people. These are, because Ashley Vargas is also Puerto Rican. It's bringing through her own experience of what the culture means to her and what it means to me and how we want to bring that out in illustrations. And so it was very collaborative in a way that I wasn't necessarily expecting because I didn't know what to expect.
I find children's book authors like yourself just so fascinating because what you've been talking about this entire conversation, these really big topics that even as adults we deal with and try to wrap our heads around, but you're not only taking these really complicated issues, but you're distilling it down to a child's perspective. What makes you want to write for such a young audience, and what makes you want to take these topics and try to make it consumable for children?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know that I've ever even thought about the genesis of my desire to be a children's author. I always wanted to be an author, but I think part of it is especially, I put that dream on pause when I went to college and then law school. I'm a lawyer in my daytime. But when I re-engaged with that dream of becoming an author when I had children and we were reading books and I had to start explaining to them, they would ask me questions that I was like, I've never in 1,000 years thought about why something works the way it does. And so it was a large part of that kind of experience of parenting that made me think through, oh, this is actually a very interesting way to engage with the world, is to think about these issues or these experiences that we kind of take for granted because it's so normalized for us, and then digest it for someone who's never experienced it or is experiencing it, for the first time, and then provide to them an avenue towards understanding and not just, well, it is what it is, and that's, figure it out. And so I feel empowered with that knowledge, and I want my kids to feel empowered. And then by extension, other children. And part of it, it's just, I just really love stories, and I love the effect stories have on people. And it's a way to make sense of the world and also root yourself in it, right? It's a way to community build and tell your community's stories and also other stories and humanize, right? Because you see a lot of similarities around different communities and cultures in their stories. And it's just a way to make sense of the world that helps me make sense of it. And then by extension, hopefully helps the kids make sense of it too.
That was Sara Echenique on her recent book, Our Roof is Blue. Forum, Beyond the Pages, is produced by Florida Humanities. Our music was created by Tampa Bay area musician JJ Padishall. You can follow him on Instagram at JJ Padishall Music. Want to get the latest issue of Forum delivered to your door 3 times a year? Become a Florida Humanities member by visiting floridahumanities.org/membership. Until next time.